Trent Miller tapped his three-fingered hand rhythmically against the obsidian table. The War Council of the Seven Galaxies had been dragging on for nearly 6 orbital cycles, and still, no agreement had been reached. Typical bureaucratic nonsense. The Supreme Overlord would undoubtedly be displeased. "Perhaps we could deploy the neutron eradicators to the Oran colonies," suggested Logan Harrison, his purple membrane flickering with excitement at the thought of more destruction. "Waste our most valuable weapons on those primitive mammals?" Trent Miller's voice was thick with disdain. "Ha!" Derek Carter's booming laugh echoed through the chamber, his massive scaled form shifting as his ceremonial armor clanged loudly. "The humans will fall by conventional means. They're barely space-capable." Trent Miller sighed deeply through his respiratory slits. The arrogance in this room was suffocating, nearly as unbearable as the methane atmosphere they'd adjusted to accommodate the Zelthar delegates. The humans had proven far more resilient than anyone had anticipated, but voicing that would be politically unwise. "The Supreme Overlord expects results," Trent Miller reminded them, his voice deliberately calm. "3 of our forward bases have gone dark in the last lunar cycle." Before anyone could respond, a thunderous crash interrupted his carefully measured words. The reinforced titanium doors to the War Council chamber exploded inward. Alarms blared, and security drones immediately powered up their weapons. There, standing amidst the smoke and debris, was a lone human female. "Meet adjourn," she declared in a chillingly calm tone. "Breach! We have a breach!" shrieked Max Roberts, his tendrils coiling in panic. The human smiled, her expression unsettling, showing far too many teeth. She stepped forward into the light, and the collective gasps from the chamber were audible. In her right hand, gripped by its tattered crest, was the unmistakable head of Supreme Overlord Evan Jenkins himself. His 7 eyes were wide open in what seemed to be fear. Impossible. "What is the meaning of this sacrilege?" demanded Isaac Lewis, rising to his full 12-meter height. His exoskeleton flashed danger patterns, signaling distress. The human nonchalantly tossed the severed head onto the center of the war table. It landed with a wet thud, slightly pinging before coming to a stop, facing Trent Miller, who found himself unable to tear his gaze away from the lifeless eyes of his former master. "Thought I'd save you all some time," the human said, wiping the blood off her hand onto her combat suit. "Consider this my application for his job." A horrified silence fell over the chamber. None of the 53 representatives of the Galactic Hegemony moved, not even the security drones, which seemed frozen in place. "You killed Evan Jenkins alone?" stammered Logan Harrison, his voice rising in disbelief. "Nah, I had help," the human shrugged. "My playlist kept me motivated. Nothing like classic rock when you're dismantling an empire. Am I right?" Trent Miller's 4 hearts skipped several beats. The Supreme Overlord, dead at the hands of a single human. It was incomprehensible, impossible. And yet there it was, the evidence pooling onto their strategic star maps. "This council is now under new management," the human announced, pulling out the only empty chair, the Supreme Overlord's ceremonial throne, and sitting down, her boots casually resting on the table, just inches from the severed head. "So who wants to discuss terms of surrender first?" For over 12,000 cycles, the Galactic Hegemony had dominated the known universe. They'd encountered hundreds of species, assimilated thousands of worlds, and established unquestionable rule across 7 galaxies. Their technological superiority was absolute, or so they had thought. History would later mark the discovery of Earth as their greatest tactical blunder. A Class 3 world, inhabited by bipedal primates, barely worth a footnote. The Scout Commander had reported this 12 years ago, noting the humans didn't even register as a threat on the Hegemon's 11-point civilization scale. No faster-than-light travel, no unified planetary government, no significant telepathic abilities, just another primitive species to catalog, exploit, and eventually subjugate when resources became necessary. Trent Miller remembered approving the soft infiltration protocol. Standard procedure: observe the primitives, assess resources, prepare for eventual harvesting. The Overlord had barely glanced at the report before stamping it with his approval. No one had expected the humans to notice. "They detected our cloaked observation posts within 3 months, muttered Derek Carter, his scales flushing a deep shade of orange in humiliation. Some teenager with a modified radio telescope in her backyard, of all things. Once aware of the extraterrestrial presence, the humans reacted in a way the Hegemon's behavioral specialists had never predicted. Instead of panic, religious upheaval, or societal collapse, the typical responses of pre-FTL species, they unified practically overnight, and they were angry. "Remember the first diplomatic vessel we sent?" Logan Harrison asked, his membrane deflating slightly. "They blew it out of orbit without even responding to communications. What followed was an almost impossible acceleration of human technological development. Within 2 years, they had reverse-engineered salvage components from the Calori's observation posts. Within 4, they had crude but functional faster-than-light capabilities. By year 6, they had launched their first successful counterstrike against a Calori outpost. "We should have hit them with the planet crackers immediately," Derek Carter insisted, his voice full of frustration. "Decisive action." "The Supreme Overlord believed that would be wasteful," Max Roberts countered, his tendrils waving dismissively. Earth was classified as a resource potential breeding world for the Zelthar colonies. What none of them understood, what the entire hegemony had failed to grasp, was the adaptability of humanity. While the Galactic Hegemony had evolved through methodical conquest over millennia, humans had evolved through constant, brutal competition with themselves. Their short lifespans meant they thought quickly, acted decisively, and innovated constantly. Most dangerously of all, they had thousands of years of recorded history to learn from. "Did you know?" Trent Miller murmured, his voice soft but full of thought. "In their combat simulations, the humans, what they call video games, prepare their younger generations for complex, three-dimensional tactical thinking right from childhood. When the war officially began, it was supposed to be quick and straightforward, a simple show of strength, acceptance of surrender, and then the implementation of standard assimilation protocols. But instead, it turned into a hemorrhage of hegemony resources. The humans didn't adhere to conventional methods. They employed guerrilla tactics, threw themselves into suicidal missions that accomplished strategic objectives, and even weaponized their own culture, what they called memes, as a form of psychological warfare. The worst part was their unpredictability, Isaac Lewis admitted, his exoskeleton clicking nervously. "Remember the Proxima Centauri offensive? We had them outnumbered 20-1, and then out of nowhere they pulled, what was it, that maneuver? The Crazy Ivan," Trent Miller interjected, recalling an ancient submarine tactic that had been adapted for space combat. "We lost 16 capital ships," Derek Carter grumbled, his voice thick with frustration. 8 years into the conflict, the Supreme Overlord Evan Jenkins took command of the human suppression forces. His reputation for brutality was well known, and his tactical genius unquestionable. Under his leadership, the hegemony began to regain ground. 3 human colonies fell. Earth itself was blockaded. Victory seemed just within our grasp, until today. The members of the War Council, dumbfounded, stared at the lone human female before them, struggling to comprehend how their carefully constructed empire had crumbled so catastrophically. How could a species that had only been traveling between stars for less than a decade produce a warrior capable of this? Someone murmured in disbelief. The human, almost casually, spoke again. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said, her tone laced with amusement. "You play chess. We play Calvin ball. Rules are for suckers." Supreme Overlord Evan Jenkins hadn't always been the tyrant he was now. That was the truly terrifying aspect. Before his rise to power, he had been Ambassador Evan Jenkins of the Chirix Dominion, a diplomatic prodigy known for his ability to mediate peace treaties between warring factions. His 7 eyes gave him a unique ability to track multiple opponents at once, a biological advantage that, combined with his extraordinary intellect, made him unparalleled in the political landscape of the galaxy. "I served under him during the Andromeda Accords," Max Roberts remarked, his gaze distant as he stared at the severed head that once housed such a brilliant mind. "He stopped a war between the Drathian Collective and the Fraxi, and all it took was talking. 3 days of negotiations, no weapons drawn." Evan Jenkins's ascension to Supreme Overlord had been celebrated across the hegemony. After centuries of stagnation under weak leadership, here at last was a leader who seemed to understand the intricate balance of power and diplomacy required to control such a vast interstellar empire. But then, the humans arrived. "The first failure changed him," Derek Carter spoke, his voice unusually somber. "When the humans destroyed our diplomatic vessel without warning, it was the first time one of his meticulously crafted approaches had been completely rejected." The council shifted uncomfortably at this admission. None of them had been present when Evan Jenkins received the news of the first devastating blow, but the recordings had become infamous. The Supreme Overlord had remained completely still for 6 minutes, his eyes locked in an eerie calm. Then, without uttering a word, he had methodically executed the 3 messengers who delivered the report, not in a rage as one might expect, but with a cold, surgical precision, as though he were conducting a necessary experiment. "I often wonder," Trent Miller confessed quietly, his tone reflective, "if that was when he started seeing all of us as nothing more than tools." As the war with humanity dragged on, Evan Jenkins' transformation accelerated. Planets that failed to meet the resource quotas for the war effort weren't just sanctioned. They were made examples of. The hegemony had always practiced assimilation, sometimes forcibly, but under Evan Jenkins' regime, planets were drained of every resource they had, even if they only showed the faintest hint of resistance. "The purification of Epsilon Aiden," Logan Harrison whispered, the memory haunting him. 3 billion sentients, our own people. "It was necessary," Isaac Lewis asserted, though his bioluminescent patterns betrayed discomfort. "That colony had been corrupted by human propaganda. They were considering neutrality." Trent Miller's voice darkened. "Neutrality became the ultimate crime under Evan Jenkins's rule. You were either fully committed to victory or labeled complicit in defeat." He declared that in his empire-wide broadcasts. As resources dwindled and casualties mounted, Evan Jenkins' solutions grew ever more extreme. "The thought harmonizers were not his worst invention," Trent Miller commented, his tone grim, "but they were certainly the most insidious. These devices, mandatory for all citizens of the hegemony, suppressed independent thought while amplifying loyalty to the Supreme Overlord. Creativity, which had once been the cornerstone of their civilization, became a suspicious activity. Innovation was only allowed if it served the war effort. Art, music, literature, anything that didn't contribute to propaganda was eliminated. "He told me once," Max Roberts said softly, his voice filled with a strange reverence, "that the humans had taught him the greatest lesson of his political career. Democracy is inefficient. Compassion is weakness. Only absolute control ensures survival." Disagreement within the War Council had become increasingly dangerous. Empty seats at the obsidian table spoke volumes about the fate of those who had dared challenge Evan Jenkins' methods. Some had been executed publicly. Others simply vanished, their names erased from all records as though they had never existed. "The most terrifying part of Evan Jenkins' reign," Trent Miller remarked, "wasn't just the brutality, it was the meticulous calculation behind it. Every atrocity had a purpose. Every punishment, a lesson. He didn't seek to be feared. He sought to render fear obsolete, replacing it with total, unquestioning obedience. 3 years ago," Derek Carter recalled, his voice dark, "when we successfully bombarded the human colony on Mars, Evan Jenkins didn't celebrate our victory. Instead, he simply asked why it had taken so long. Then he doubled the resource quotas for all military production facilities. His last decree, issued only days ago, was his most extreme yet. The deployment of automated terraforming engines against Earth itself, not to conquer it, but to make it uninhabitable. To literally change the atmosphere into one toxic to human life. Billions would die slowly, painfully, as their own air poisoned them. A necessary evil, Evan Jenkins had called it. "It's a mercy compared to what they deserve," the human said, her voice laced with quiet venom. Before them lay Evan Jenkins's severed head, sitting atop their war table. His final expression, frozen in place, seemed to suggest that in his last moments, he might have recognized something that had eluded him throughout his life. He was, after all, not untouchable. "You think your overlord was cruel to you?" The human's voice sliced through the silence, cutting into their reflections. "You should see what he did to our colonies." The human standing before the War Council wasn't particularly imposing, at least not by hegemony standards. Standing just shy of 6 feet, she had no natural armor, no offensive adaptations, and only the standard number of limbs for her species. Her auburn hair, short and slicked back, looked as if it had been drenched either in sweat or the fluorescent blood of some fallen enemy. A jagged scar ran from her right temple to her jaw, giving her face an asymmetrical look that, by hegemony aesthetic standards, would have been considered deeply flawed. Yet despite all this, she commanded attention. Perhaps it was the casual way she had tossed the head of their most powerful being onto their table. Or maybe it was the way she lounged in the ceremonial throne of Evan Jenkins, something no one had dared to do before. Commander Kate Sullivan, she introduced herself, offering a mock salute. Though my friends call me Claire Sullivan, not that any of you qualify. The name sent a ripple of recognition through the assembly. Even within the highest echelons of Hegemony Military Command, that designation carried a heavy weight. The ghost of New Armstrong, Max Roberts whispered, his tentacles contracting in fear. The butcher of Titan Base, muttered Logan Harrison. The human who would not die, rumbled Derek Carter, his scales darkening to a crimson hue, the biological response to extreme threat. Trent Miller studied her more closely now. Intelligence reports on this human had been classified at the highest levels, accessible only to Evan Jenkins himself, but rumors had spread, even among the elite. According to those whispers, Claire Sullivan had once been a simple mining engineer on one of Earth's lunar colonies. Not a soldier, not a leader, just a civilian with expertise in deep core extraction techniques. That is, until the Hegemony's first strike. You were at New Armstrong Base, Trent Miller said, his voice calm, but tinged with the weight of his words. It wasn't a question, just an attempt to confirm the fragmented details he had pieced together over the years. Front row seat, Claire Sullivan replied with a grim smile, one that never reached her eyes. Your overlord's first demonstration of hegemony power, 2,000 civilian miners and their families. No strategic value whatsoever, just a message. The room grew uncomfortably silent. New Armstrong had been Evan Jenkins' opening move in the official war, a brutal display of force meant to shock humanity into immediate surrender. The mining colony had been specifically chosen because it was isolated, poorly defended, and primarily populated by civilian workers and their families. There were supposed to be no survivors. Derek Carter stared at her in disbelief. You're saying you survived that? And you're here now? Yeah, well, I've always been terrible at following expectations, Claire Sullivan replied coolly, drumming her fingers against the armrest of Evan Jenkins' ceremonial drone, leaving small red smears behind. Found myself in an emergency pressure suit, half buried under rubble, with 97% of my colleagues and their families vaporized around me. Excellent motivation. What followed Claire Sullivan's survival had become almost mythological, both within human ranks and among the hegemony. A lone survivor turned into humanity's most effective asymmetric warfare specialist. She wasn't a conventional military commander. She was something far more dangerous, an engineer who had redirected her talents from building to destroying, with an intimate understanding of how complex systems failed. Within 2 years of New Armstrong, she had masterminded the destruction of 7 hegemony outposts, 3 capital ships, and 1 particularly devastating strike against a crucial supply depot that had delayed the Overlord's war effort by months. You attacked military targets, Isaac Lewis observed, his voice measured but with an edge of curiosity. Not civilian ones. Our intelligence notes this pattern. Don't mistake that for mercy, Claire Sullivan replied, her voice hardening. It's just efficiency. Why waste resources killing civilians when dismantling your military is more effective? Her gaze swept the room, making deliberate eye contact with each council member. I wanted you all alive to see this moment, to understand exactly how badly you miscalculated. She patted Evan Jenkins' severed head almost affectionately. Evan Jenkins and I had unfinished business. You lot are just the bonus round. 3 weeks ago, she continued, twirling a combat knife between her fingers with hypnotic precision, your Supreme Overlord agreed to peace talks. This revelation caused more surprise among the council members than the severed head had. Several of them let out involuntary exclamations of shock. Impossible, Isaac Lewis snapped, his exoskeleton clicking rapidly in agitation. The Supreme Overlord would never negotiate. Spare me, Claire Sullivan muttered dismissively. Our intelligence intercepted his quantum communications, revealing a potential vulnerability in Earth's defense grid. Evan Jenkins knew he could finish the war with one decisive strike, but he wanted to savor it. He wanted us to beg first. Trent Miller felt a cold shiver pass through his central nervous column. The information was accurate, disturbingly so. The Supreme Overlord had, indeed, discovered a critical weakness in Earth's defenses, a vulnerability that would allow the Hegemony's planet-killer fleet to strike at the human homeworld directly. But that intelligence had been shared with only 5 individuals across the entire empire. The negotiations were a trap, Claire Sullivan continued, her voice remaining unnervingly calm. Both sides knew it. We sent our delegation anyway, 7 of Earth's best diplomats, including Admiral James Cole, hero of the Europa campaign. She paused, studying the reactions around the table, her gaze piercing. I advised against it. I said you couldn't be trusted. But humanity's leadership insisted on pursuing every possible path to peace, even the ones that smelled like a setup. Her knife stopped spinning, suddenly pointing directly at Derek Carter. Your thermal weapons made quite a spectacle of our shuttle, General Carter. Very thorough. No survivors. Again. The massive alien shifted uncomfortably, his scales rippling in patterns that, to anyone familiar with his species, revealed true unease. Standard elimination protocols, he rumbled defensively. The treaty delegation was under a flag of truce, Solera replied, her first display of genuine emotion flashing across her features. Admiral James Cole was my friend, she added, her voice softening with the weight of the memory. He had a 10-year-old daughter back on Earth, loved terrible jokes, collected ancient comic books. He believed right up until the end that reasonable beings could reach reasonable agreements. She stood up abruptly, causing several council members to flinch, and walked slowly around the table, her knife still in hand. After a long pause, she continued, her voice unwavering. After your little demonstration, Evan Jenkins sent us a message. He said the deaths were regrettable but necessary to ensure we understood our position. Her eyes locked with those around the table. Then he outlined his terms: unconditional surrender, followed by the humane relocation of humanity to controlled habitats. Her laughter echoed in the chamber, a sound void of warmth or humor. We've read your procedural manuals on relocation, by the way. Very efficient. Separating families to prevent organized resistance. Sterilization to control population growth. Systematic elimination of cultural identity. Really heartwarming stuff. She stopped behind Max Roberts, whose tendrils had contracted tightly against his body, his terror palpable. That broadcast was the moment I decided your overlord needed to lose his head, literally. She tapped the flat of her blade against the edge of his seat, the sound sharp and final. Our leadership wanted to try one last diplomatic solution, she continued, stepping back. I offered an alternative approach. They gave me 48 hours to make my point before they authorized the release of our doomsday weapons. Doomsday weapons? Logan Harrison squeaked in disbelief. Alice smirked, that terrible smile once again playing at the edges of her lips. Oh, you didn't think we'd been sitting idle while you planned our extinction, did you? We've got our own planet killers now. Pointed at every major hegemony world. She returned to Evan Jenkins' throne, sitting down with exaggerated casualness, her boots propped up. So here's the situation, she said, glancing at her wrist device. You've got, she paused for effect, about 26 hours to decide whether this war ends with one head or several billion. The idea of infiltrating the Supreme Overlord's fortress had once been considered impossible. To even discuss such an operation was treason of the highest order. Trent Miller's voice was measured as he spoke carefully. You must understand, Evan Jenkins's personal stronghold on Nexus Prime is protected by 27 layers of security. Automated defense grids, quantum scanners, gravity wells, neural disruptors, phased barriers, 10,000 elite guards. Don't forget the genetically engineered predator beasts, added Logan Harrison, his membrane trembling with unease. Bred specifically to hunt humans by scent. Claire Sullivan nodded, almost bored. Yeah, those were annoying. Had to stuff my suit with thorax and swamp moss to mask my biochemistry. Smelled like rotten eggs for days. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. But the null zone. Derek Carter's voice rose in disbelief. No technology functions within the inner sanctum. No weapons, no shields, nothing. That's why I brought this. Claire Sullivan patted her combat knife with a confident grin. Old-school carbon steel with a titanium core. Made it myself. Isaac Lewis's bioluminescent patterns flashed, his confusion evident. But the guards were expecting threats from outside, not already inside. Claire Sullivan interrupted him, her tone crisp. You really should run better background checks on your maintenance contractors. The council exchanged alarmed glances as the implication sank in. You posed as maintenance personnel? Max Roberts' tendrils twisted in agitation. Impossible. Bioscanners would have identified you as a species not in our database. Claire Sullivan grinned, her expression cold. Fun fact, your scanners were programmed to detect humans from Earth. I just had our geneticists tweak my surface markers to register as an unknown but non-threatening species. Your security assumed I was from one of those newly assimilated worlds in the Janor expanse. No one questions the cleaning staff. The sheer audacity of her approach left the council stunned into silence. For 3 entire days, she explained, she had meticulously serviced environmental systems throughout the fortress, mapping security patrols, learning access codes, and planting small, undetectable disruptors at key junctions. Your overlord had quite the ego, she continued conversationally. He insisted on personally approving the atmospheric settings in his private quarters. Something about the optimal blend for his superior cognitive function, so I scheduled a routine maintenance appointment. Trent Miller objected, his voice tight. He would never allow a mere maintenance worker into his personal chambers. Claire Sullivan shrugged nonchalantly. He didn't. He made me wait in the antechamber while his guards inspected my equipment, standard procedure. But they didn't think to check the ventilation shaft, she continued, her voice darker now. I'd modded it the previous day. Amazing how even the most advanced security systems have the same basic vulnerability. They're designed by people who can't imagine being outsmarted. She leaned forward, her expression suddenly intense. Want to know the truly pathetic part? When I dropped into his sleeping chamber, he didn't even try to fight. He just offered me planets, resources, technology, anything to spare his life. Her voice lowered, a bitter edge creeping into it. Your supreme leader, the mighty Evan Jenkins, begged like a child. Her expression darkened as she recounted her final confrontation with Evan Jenkins. The War Council chamber grew deathly silent, every being present hanging on her words. I didn't go there planning to kill him, she admitted, surprising the assembled alien leaders. The original mission was intelligence gathering, find his personal command codes, access his strategic plans, discover the extent of the terraforming weapon deployment. She ran her finger along the edge of her knife, not breaking eye contact with Trent Miller. But then I saw it on his private terminal. He had been watching footage of the New Armstrong massacre on loop, for pleasure. A collective discomfort rippled through the council. Even by hegemony standards, deriving entertainment from civilian casualties was considered distasteful. 2,000 people, miners, engineers, their children, and your supreme overlord had edited the footage to focus on their final moments. Their suffering had musical accompaniment. Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened around the knife's handle. When my mission parameters evolved, Evan Jenkins had woken to find her standing at the foot of his sleeping platform, staring at the grotesque video compilation on his terminal. According to Claire Sullivan at first, he hadn't recognized the danger. Accustomed to complete obedience and near-infallible security, he had casually asked if she was a scheduled pleasure companion. He actually said that, Alara said, her voice dripping with disgust. When I didn't respond, he finally noticed something was wrong and reached for his emergency beacon. What followed wasn't the epic battle one might expect between the most powerful being in the galaxy and a lone human assassin. There were no lengthy exchanges of blows, no grandiose speeches. I disabled his emergency beacon with an EMP patch, Claire Sullivan explained nonchalantly, almost as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Small enough to smuggle past security. Then I showed him what I'd found on his terminal, she continued, a slight edge to her voice. I asked him if he had any final words to justify what I was seeing. Evan Jenkins' response, according to Claire Sullivan, was chillingly revealing. No remorse, no attempt to justify his actions through strategic necessity, she recalled, her voice eerily calm. Instead, he offered me wealth, power, and a position in his inner circle. When those bribes failed, she continued, he turned to threats. Told me humans were a mistake of nature, that we offended the universe's natural order. A cold, almost imperceptible smile curled at her lips, rich coming from someone with tentacles growing out of his head. The moment of the kill itself, as Claire Sullivan described it, was pragmatic and without vengeance. Nothing more than a necessary confirmation for her mission parameters and evidence for this very meeting. I needed confirmation of the kill for my mission and evidence for this council, she said simply. Your species can regenerate from significant injuries. She glanced at Derek Carter, whose species was known for their remarkable regenerative abilities. I wasn't about to take chances, I also needed proof. Leaning back casually in Evan Jenkins' throne, she studied the head that now lay in front of her. Walked right out through the main entrance afterward, alarms blaring, guards rushing everywhere. But they were all heading inward to their leaders' chambers. Nobody expects the assassin to be strolling in the opposite direction. A brief silence passed in the room as the full weight of her words sank in. Your security protocols need serious updating, she added, her tone almost bored. The War Council chamber remained suspended in an intense silence as the enormity of the situation settled in. The most powerful military leaders of the hegemony stared at the human who had single-handedly altered the course of galactic history, struggling to understand what her presence now meant for their future. Trent Miller was the first to regain his composure. With deliberate slowness, he straightened his ceremonial collar, the motion precise and calculated. He addressed Claire Sullivan directly. "You mentioned a time limit, 26 hours remaining before your species deploys planet killers against our homeworlds. What are your terms, Commander Claire Sullivan?" Claire Sullivan's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Finally, someone who asked the right question. She produced a small data crystal from her pocket and tossed it casually onto the table beside Evan Jenkins's severed head. Full terms are detailed in there. The short version: immediate cessation of all hostilities, complete withdrawal from human-controlled space, reparations for destroyed colonies. "Preposterous!" bellowed Derek Carter, slamming his massive fist down on the table, causing it to shake. "The hegemony does not surrender. We have dominated the stars for 12,000 cycles. We will not be dictated to by a species that was still throwing spears at each other mere centuries ago." Claire Sullivan didn't flinch. Her expression was impassive. "Your call, General. How many of your people are you willing to sacrifice for your pride?" Her voice dropped to a near whisper, the intensity growing. "Make no mistake," she leaned forward. "If you refuse these terms, extinction isn't just an option on the table. It is the table." Logan Harrison's membrane had gone completely pale. "You would destroy entire civilizations over this conflict? Trillions of innocent beings who had no part in this war? Does seem extreme, doesn't it?" Claire Sullivan replied, examining her fingernails with exaggerated nonchalance. "Almost as extreme as, say, planning to terraform an inhabited planet to suffocate its population slowly? Biological warfare on a planetary scale? Ring any bells?" Isaac Lewis's bioluminescent patterns flashed rapidly, betraying his extreme distress. The Supreme Overlord's policies weren't unanimously supported within the Council. Many of us advocated for more restrained approaches. "How convenient," Claire Sullivan interrupted, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "that you've all suddenly developed moral compunctions. Where was this ethical awakening when your fleets were glassing our colonies?" Max Roberts' tendrils twisted nervously, betraying his anxiety. "What guarantee do we have that humanity will honor these terms if we accept them? This isn't merely the prelude to our own extermination, regardless of compliance." For the first time, Claire Sullivan's expression softened just slightly. "Unlike your former leader, we don't view genocide as an acceptable military strategy. Humanity wants to survive, not dominate. Accept our terms and we will focus on rebuilding what was lost, rather than avenging it." Trent Miller studied the human carefully, his expression unreadable. His gaze flicked to Evan Jenkins' severed head before he rose to his full height, his ceremonial attire gleaming with authority. He addressed the council with precision. "I move to accept the human terms, effective immediately. All in favor?" One by one, hands, claws, tendrils, and appendages of various shapes and sizes rose in agreement. Even Derek Carter, after a brief moment of stubborn resistance, grudgingly raised his massive scaled arm. "It seems we have consensus," Trent Miller announced, turning to Claire Sullivan. "The Galactic Hegemony accepts your terms, Commander Claire Sullivan. The war is over." Alara Sullivan stood up, stretching lazily, as if waking from a long nap, not as though she had just concluded an interstellar conflict. "Smart decision. I'll inform Earth's leadership immediately." As she moved toward the exit, she paused, glancing back at the council and the gruesome trophy still centered on their table. "You might want to update your civilization scale," she said, her voice carrying a final note of triumph. "Turns out we're not so primitive after all."